Right, everybody, it is 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get this rolling. Good morning, I am Taylor Post, Swiftland's Office Manager, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Library of Congress Subject Headings, Basics, and today's presenter, Dr. Karen Snow. Dr. Karen Snow is an Associate Professor and PhD Program Director in the School of Information Studies at Dominican University in River Forest, Illinois. She received her Ph.D. of Information Science in 2011 from the University of North Texas, where she taught cataloging courses primarily online from 2006 to 2011 for the Department of Library and Information Sciences. She previously worked as a cataloger in the Rare Book Room University Archives in the Technical Services Department at the University of North Texas. She currently teaches beginning and advanced cataloging courses at Dominican University, both face-to-face and online. Please welcome Karen and enjoy her webinar this morning. Karen?
All right, thank you so much, Taylor. Can everyone hear me all right? Should have tested my microphone before, but I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. All right. Perfect. Okay. Well, good morning. Good morning. I am excited to be here today. It's been a few years since I have given a webinar for Swiftland. I've obviously been giving workshops for a while, but not webinars. So this is a nice change of pace. As normal, I appreciate any comments and questions that you have throughout the webinar, as long as it doesn't get us way off track. I'm fine with you asking questions and in that chat box, preferably, and I'll kind of monitor that as we move along. And also, if I cut out at any point, if you can't hear me, if there's any technical issues, please let me know, and we'll try our best to get that sorted out, okay? So with that said, I want to just show you guys what we're going to talk about today in this webinar and the hour that we have together. So first of all, before I get into Library of Congress subject headings itself, okay, because that's obviously our focus, I want to talk first about the why. You know, why Library of Congress subject headings? What are they? What is subject cataloging, right? So, which is what Library of Congress subject headings is part of, what it is, and the different methods for achieving it. Just briefly, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about each. I just want to give that overview. In addition to what are control vocabularies. So, Library of Congress subject headings is what is called a controlled vocabulary. I'll explain what that is and why it's important and its purpose. Then give a brief background and history and the principles of Library of Congress subject headings, for LCSH. I'll use LCSH for short. Once again, just very briefly, because I want to get more into like the practical application of LCSH, but I think it's important to have a decent, understanding about the underlying principles of LCSH in order to understand why you're seeing the subject headings that you do, right? I want to talk about how we access Library of Congress subject headings, right? So most of you guys, I'm assuming, have seen subject headings in your catalog, but there are separate tools that we use to actually access the Library of Congress subject heading list. Right, so I'm going to talk about different ways that we can access LCSH, both paid or like subscription-based tools, as well as free tools. How to search Library of Congress subject headings using these various web resources. And then just very briefly, Library of Congress subject headings in MARC. That's the machine readable cataloging, the encoding standard that probably most of us use in our library catalogs, okay? So I won't get too deep into that, just because this webinar, I really designed it for those who may not be catalogers, right? Who may be reference staff and so forth, who may not have a great depth of knowledge on the nitty-gritty, if you will, of library cataloging. So I just want to kind of touch on that with the understanding that there will be another webinar next month on just subheadings, which I'll explain more later, and then a workshop in February, a full day, in-person workshop where we can get more in depth about all these topics, okay? So that's the plan. So I'll try my best to stick to this, but like I said, just let me know if at any point you have any questions or anything about what I'm saying. Okay, so first things first, this is just a typical screenshot. I believe I took this from WorldCat of these subject headings and subheadings that we would find in a typical library catalog. And when you see subject headings within a library catalog, more often than not, they will be Library of Congress subject headings. It's one of the most popular subject heading lists in the world. So there are other lists, as we'll talk about, but it's important, regardless of what area of librarianship you're in, whether you're a cataloger or not, if you're a reference librarian, it's important to have a basic understanding of Library of Congress subject headings so you can better serve your patrons, whoever they may be. And Library of Congress subject headings is part of subject cataloging. So, cataloging is a pretty broad area, and subject cataloging is focused more on what I call the aboutness of a resource. What is called descriptive cataloging is more about the isness, if you will. So what a resource is versus what it's about. So I also divide this up into like container versus content attributes. So this book, for example, is titled a certain thing. Titled Twilight. It is created by Stephanie Meyer, part of a series and so forth. Okay, so that's oftentimes that information, the isness or the descriptive part of cataloging can be gleaned by just holding the resource and looking at it to see what is the title, who is the author, and so forth. So oftentimes there's additional research that needs to be done, but in the basic level, that's what we can do. But the aboutness, if you've ever tried to capture the aboutness of something, can be a little more tricky, right? So it's something that yes, you can glean to a certain extent by looking at the item, like reading the back cover, the dust jacket, and so forth. But can be a little bit more tricky in trying to determine what something is about, right? Especially if you haven't read it, yeah? And we just don't have the luxury of reading or experiencing all the various resources that come across our desks, right? So keep that in mind, that's what we're gonna focus on now, is Library of Congress subject headings and the aboutness of something, even though LCSH does have certain amount of isness, if you will, as well, as we'll talk about. And sometimes that's difficult, the determining aboutness, right? I mean, with books, as I said, we can look at various parts of the book, the table of contents, the title, and so forth. But some other things, not only is it difficult to determine the aboutness, but may not even be desirable if you think about it. So with like here, like in the bottom left-hand corner, we have like a music CD. Upper right is a video recording. Some of those may be more may serve the patron better just by maybe describing like the genre, right? The movie genre or the music genre that it's a part of, right? Sometimes going beyond that, which is not really what it's about. It's the genre, right? But other things like a microscope or a hand puppet, can we really say what that's about? You know what I'm saying? Like it's better, it's easier, if you will, to describe what it is, like the attributes of that resource, and it may be that our users prefer just to kind of describe what it is versus what it's about. So that's something as we talk about Library of Congress subject headings and how we apply subject headings to a resource. That's something we need to think about. Is applying a Library of Congress subject heading desirable or even possible for certain resources, right? And so one thing, like I said, one thing that we'll talk about in the future, especially at the workshop, in-person workshop in February, are the other form and genre headings, which may be more appropriate for certain types of resources than the subject headings. So keep that in mind. Okay, but otherwise, like I said before, since we can't read every single thing that is in our collection, we have to use the resources available to us to determine what something is about, right? So using the title, table of contents, maybe the back cover summary, dust jacket, or outside sources, right? So I'm sure that for those of you guys who have used Library of Congress subject headings before, like going to like Amazon.com or the publisher's website to determine what something is about, because sometimes it's not obvious, right? It's not obvious what the subject is, or the title is misleading, things like that. So one thing we need to keep in mind as we are thinking about how to categorize a resource according to subject is, what is the author's intent? Okay, and that may not always be clear, but even if something like I'm looking at the A Million Little Pieces that cover right now, for those of you guys who are familiar with that book, it is a memoir, this guy's memoir, this author's memoir of his time as like an alcoholic and a drug addict, and his brushes with the law and so forth. That was a very popular book several years ago. That it turns out he exaggerated quite a bit of that information. That it was not always accurate. So in this case, at least initially, the author's intent was to present this as a nonfiction memoir, but it's come out that it's not. So what do we do with that information? So it's tricky, right? It's tricky to know what it can be about, what you should do with the subject heading. So so Sarah, like the museums use the nomenclature books, yeah, for acquisition. So yeah, so good. That's fine. Yeah. So each individual institution may have their own policies on how to approach this. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I'm going to talk about. So thank you for bringing that up, Sarah. But I'm going to just talk about best practices for for what Library of Congress does. But it may be that at the local level, you may have some local rules, right, for what you do. So keeping that in mind. So here I just kind of put up a bunch of covers, just like eating people is wrong is not actually about eating people and the wrongness of it. I think it's a novel about not that. And mommy drinks because you're bad. It's not about mommy's alcohol problems, but it's like a religious guidebook for children about various situations they may find themselves in. And I like this especially for kids books, right? It can be interesting to determine what to assign. So this book about Red, the crayon, is about a crayon, but it's also about identity as well. So it's we do have to kind of go just beyond the surface to make sure that we're capturing what the author is intending, the subject the author is intending. So let's see, I just lost it. Who was it Jocelyn? Did you have your? I think it was Jocelyn. Sorry, whoever had their hand up, please feel free to speak. I just lost it there. Or speak or type, whatever you prefer. Anybody? Okay. Not seeing it, but feel free to jump in if you decide to type any questions. So, all right. So with subject cataloging, there are three main areas of subject cataloging, and these are areas that I teach as well in my classes. Library of Congress subject headings is a controlled vocabulary, which is a standardized list of terms that have been selected for consistent use in describing or indexing resources. Okay, so that's what it is at the basic level. At thesaurus, you may have seen the term thesaurus before, not necessarily that a thesaurus like you would for finding like synonyms and so forth, but like the art and architecture thesaurus is another type of controlled vocabulary. It just tends to be a much more specific and specialized in the terminology it includes. But I like this phrase: control vocabularies are not suggestions. All right. So if you're using a control vocabulary like Library of Congress headings, you cannot pick and choose which terms to use. If you're using LCSH, you're using the terms that it says to use. Period. Okay, so it may be difficult at times to accept that because sometimes LCSH does not use the terminology that is most popular, so to speak. But it is, like I said, if you're using LCSH, you do have to use the terms that it says to use. Period. Okay. There's also other types of, other forms of subject cataloging, like uncontrolled vocabularies. And all these can be used, in conjunction with it. It's not like you can only use controlled vocabularies and only use uncontrolled, right? So that we can use these different types of vocabularies. Uncontrolled can just be like a keyword, like a natural language keyword search, non-standardized terms used to describe resources. In addition to like social tagging and folksonomies. I don't know how many of you guys allow social tagging in your catalogs, but that can be also quite helpful in kind of providing additional terminology for users if the Library of Congress subject headings are not, enough for helping them find what they're looking for. So, and then finally, classification. I know that sometimes it's difficult to realize that classification is a part of subject cataloging, but it is. But instead of using, terms, they use typically numerical or alphanumerical codes, so numbers or letter number codes to represent a topic. But in addition to providing, the codes for the topic, it organizes items on the shelf. So it kind of goes beyond Library of Congress subject headings. So like Dewey Decimal and Library of Congress classifications are both, the most popular classification schemes in the United States. So those last two, uncontrolled and classification, we're setting those aside for now because that's not what we're focusing on in this webinar. So we're focusing on control vocabulary, specifically LCSH. So as I mentioned before, we have, an organized arrangements of words and phrases. It typically includes preferred and variant terms. So it says this is the term that is the kind of authorized term that we use in LCSH, and then it lists often, variants, right? So if like just here's, you can see an example on the right-hand side. This is from Library of Congress subject headings and classification web, where the authorized term is in bold. And then it also has this UF. We'll talk more about this stuff a little bit later on, used for Pluto planet. So now, as we know, Pluto has been downgraded to a dwarf planet and is not a planet. So this variant Pluto planet tells you, don't use that. Instead, use what's in bold. Okay, we'll talk more about that, I promise. It usually has a defined scope, the control vocabulary, or describes a specific domain. So LCSH describing the bibliographic domain, if you will. And ideally, each term in the vocabulary should have an unambiguous and non-redundant definition. So unfortunately, this may not happen in practice. In fact, Library of Congress subject headings is like the worst offender in this regard, is that it does not often have definitions associated with the headings, which make it difficult. Sometimes you may actually have to just kind of search for a subject heading in your catalog or in WorldCat to kind of see how it's being applied and used, as opposed to having an actual definition for you. But other vocabularies are much better about that. So for example, here's some other examples, LCSH obviously being one control vocabulary, but Sears, which is popular for like school and small public libraries. Medical subject headings, or MESH for short, is used in like medical libraries typically. So a lot of medical terminology there. And then the art and architecture thesaurus, or the AAT, which is great providing definitions. I really like that one. That, as you can probably figure out, that it's primarily for art and architecture type of resources there. So keep that in mind. That and once again, for those of you guys who do catalog, especially copy cataloging, you've probably seen a variety of different vocabularies provided within a record. And I'll later on, when we get to MARC, we'll talk about how to figure that out, which vocabulary is being used in a record. So it's not always obvious from like the user point of view and the user view of the catalog. Purpose. So, purpose of a control vocabulary is to provide terminology to the catalog and retrieve information, right? It's really quite important to have these because, we can't always do like a full search of the item itself, and that may not actually even provide us with, efficient subject terminology to find what we're looking for. We need to have, if we do want to have effective retrieval of resources, it's important to have consistent terminology that is used for proper collocation, right? So if we look at the left-hand side here with this Pluto dwarf planet, that one that I showed you in the previous slide, the Pluto dwarf planet heading, if we do that, we do a subject search for Pluto dwarf planet and specifically juvenile literature. That way we know that we'll only get resources that are about Pluto the planet as opposed to Pluto like the Disney character or any other type of Pluto. And then specifically for juveniles, right? So if we are helping a juvenile patron, it's helpful then to kind of take out, not retrieve those resources about Pluto that are aimed at adults, right? So it really does help us target our searches if we have the appropriate Library of Congress subject heading. And like I said, sometimes it's difficult to figure out what the subject heading should be, but once you do, it makes the search so much more efficient. So, which is very nice. And control vocabularies help us solve two main problems in cataloging. One is ambiguity. Ambiguity meaning the same word can be used to refer to different concepts, persons, places, or things. And a method that we use to differentiate words is the disambiguation. That's that method of differentiating words. And a popular way of applying disambiguation is through the use of parenthetical qualifiers. So I'm going to switch planets now, just because Mercury's are a great one for this in terms of like the different types of Mercuries. But there's a Mercury planet, Mercury the Roman deity. There's all sorts of Mercuries, right? But keep in mind that even though this is the parenthetical qualifiers, having the more specific category, if you will, for that particular term, like Mercury in parentheses planet, that parenthetical qualifier is popular in Library of Congress subject headings. It's not the only way that we can differentiate between headings, but there has to be some way, right? So we'll talk about that. In LCSH, you're not going to find the same heading, the same exact heading used multiple times. There's always going to be some difference between the headings to make them unique, right? That then allows us for that collocation by a unique word, okay? So, yes. And then the other issue that control vocabularies help us solve is synonymy, so the opposite problem, where more than one word or phrase can represent the same concept, person, place, or thing. So here is an example of this, one of my favorites, where all of these, phrases that you see here refer to the same event, the First World War. So you can imagine that there are plenty of patrons. They come in, they need to do some research for a class on World War I. Like, oh, what do I type in to get all the resources in my collection, in the library collection that are about the First World War? Ideally, we don't want them to have to come up with the phrases that every single one that refers to World War I. Ideally, we want them to just have to search using one, right? One heading, and then everything on that topic will come up. Now, in Library of Congress subject headings, that's the key for that, right? And sometimes Library of Congress does not always choose the one that we think they should choose. In this case, it is World War 1914 to 1918 is the authorized Library of Congress subject heading for this event. But once you do determine what it is, it like I said, it makes it a lot easier to find works on that particular topic as opposed to typing in all the various ways we can search for it, right? And it's the same thing with names, right? So if you're familiar with like name authority work, then it's the same concept, right? Just choosing one form of the name so you're not having to type in all the various forms, right? Search and browse, right? And there's many benefits to control vocabularies, and we've already talked about some of them, but you may have been in conversations with higher ups, in the administration, your supervisors and so forth about, what's the point of this? Why do we even need to bother with having a control vocabulary here? I mean, especially if the terminology is not that user-friendly, right? I mean, what's the point of this? Why spend the time to deal with this? Because, can't words from elsewhere in the record, like the title, if there's a summary, right? If there's table of contents, most people do keyword searching anyway, right? So, what's the point if we have these words elsewhere in the record to add these? Well, I'll tell you that there has been a study on the benefits of control vocabularies, and here's a citation here for this article in Cataloging and Classification Quarterly. It's published in 2015, that proved, at least with their, what they were working with, the catalog they were working with, that if there was no controlled subject vocabulary in a record, then almost 30% of the hits would be lost. Okay, so which is pretty significant, right? Pretty significant amount of hits would not be captured by a patron doing a search if we did not include any control vocabulary. So keep that in mind in case your boss ever says, what's the point of this? Let's just stop including subject control vocabularies. There you go. There's your proof. There's your evidence that it is actually beneficial. Okay. Because it does, even the control vocabulary may have a terminology there that is not in the title, the summary, the table of contents, elsewhere in the record, right? So as we've talked about, sometimes it's not clear just based upon this information what the word is about, and also just kind of providing those additional terms can be very helpful. And assigning subject headings, another important concept that we need to keep in mind when working with Library of Congress subject headings in particular is this idea of scope match, this principle of scope match. This is something that Library of Congress subject headings uses, and Library of Congress uses this, consistently. It's this idea that, so it refers to the level of depth in which books are indexed. So it says here, as a rule, catalogers try to assign only as many headings to a work as are necessary to sum up the subject of the work as a whole. In other words, they will not usually assign headings for each individual chapter or section of a book. So let's talk about that. So, even though with like tagging, you can tag a work, whatever tags that you want that covers, even like the most a subject that's covered in a very small portion of the book. You can do that. With Library of Congress subject headings, you cannot. The rule of thumb for Library of Congress is the 20% rule, right? And I'll come back to that. But it's the idea that a work, the topic of a work has to be covered in at least 20% of that work in order to have a subject heading assigned for that topic. Okay, so we're not going to assign a subject heading for every single chapter, every single topic that's covered in a book. All right, that's not going to happen. What you need to think about is what the work is about as a whole, and then only assign subject headings for those topics. So for that reason, sometimes you may not have that many subject headings applied to books. Sometimes you do, but sometimes you don't. And this is covered, these ideas of exhaustivity and specificity are part of this. Okay, so once again, I want to just talk about this briefly. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of LCSH, so exhaustivity being the degree or extent to which a resource is about a given topic, concept, or person. So this kind of helps us identify how many subject terms we need to describe a resource. So you have to, as best as you can, think about what this resource is about as a whole. Okay, and that will help guide you on how many subject terms you need to include. And how specific, so specificity, how general or specific is the term or terms used to describe a resource. So, and that can be tricky with Library of Congress subject headings, is how specific you need to be. According to the Library of Congress, you need to be as specific as possible, right? So if you have a work on fruit in general, you need to assign the subject heading fruit. You do not need to assign subject headings, or you should not assign subject headings for all the individual fruits discussed. Okay, so don't assign subject headings for bananas, apples, pears, everything like that, whatever is covered. If the work is about fruit generally, then you assign fruit. However, if the work is only about apples, you assign apples, right? You don't assign fruit, because it's just about apples, right? Just, another example, if you ever work on the American Civil War, you assign American Civil War as a subject heading. I'm not saying that's actually the authorized heading. I'm just saying just about that topic. You assign whatever the authorized LCSH is for the American Civil War, but don't assign a heading for the American history generally. Okay, you have to be specific as possible about the work, what the work is about. Okay, and that can be very frustrating at times, but that's what Library of Congress does, is it tries to be as specific as possible in its subject headings. All right, just a brief background of history of LCSH, so we understand kind of where Library of Congress is coming from. This has been around for a long time, over 100 years. The Library of Congress subject headings began in 1898 in order to describe its collection. Library of Congress is its collection. So keep that in mind. It still is very focused on ensuring that subject headings are used are created that make the most sense within their collection and for their user population, even though it's used around the world now. But that it was used just initially in 1898 for their collection, but it was first published for others to use in 1914. And it was originally published as subject headings used in the dictionary catalogs of the Library of Congress. And thankfully, the title changed in 1975 to just Library of Congress subject headings. So much easier to handle. Like I said, it's a control vocabulary. We've talked about that. It's a hierarchical scheme, so it places terms in context of broader and narrower terms. So you'll see that we have, a broader and then a narrower, then a narrower, a narrow. I'll show you that hierarchy within classification web here in just a minute. But it also contains associative relationships, so like related terms, right? So terms, headings that are both valid that have a connection to one another. And I think personally that there should be more associative relationships included in LCSH, but it's not my list. Right? So regardless, they do have that. So speaking of which, this is classification web is one tool that one can use to access Library of Congress subject headings. It is one of the subscription-based ones, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. But I just wanted to show you guys some entries here so that we can discuss some of the meanings of like this, UF and BT and SA and all that good stuff. So you kind of know what you're looking at here, which this is really what captures the hierarchy within Library of Congress subject headings and the associative relationships and so forth. So first of all, if you're using classification web, which you may not, and that's totally fine if you don't, the authorized Library of Congress subject headings and subheadings are in bold. Okay, so Mercury planet in this, if you look at the example on the left, Mercury planet atmosphere and so forth. If it's not in bold, then you can't use it. All right, it's not valid. And then the hyperlinked headings and subheadings, you can click on those to go to those entries in LCSH. So if let's just look under Mercury planet, it says BT inner planets. I can just click on inner planets to go to that entry in classification web to kind of read more about that. But and then I talked about UF for used for. So if we look under Mercury planet atmosphere, that second entry on the left, it does say that we want to use Mercury planet, and then that long hyphen indicates a main heading subheading relationship, which we'll talk more about later, especially next webinar. But it says we want to use that instead of atmosphere of Mercury in Mercurian atmosphere. So that UF, whatever comes after that UF means you don't use that. that's the variant, right? Then BT for broader term. So it says here at the top, inner planets is broader in the hierarchy than Mercury planet. So inner planets being the highest part of that hierarchy that were shown here. Then Mercury planet is more specific. And then NT, meaning narrower term, is more specific still. So if our work that we're cataloging is about space flight to Mercury, then we should choose that. We should choose space flight to Mercury instead of just Mercury planet. Remember, kind of going back to this idea of scope match and specificity if it's about that specific topic. I don't have an example here on the page, but the SA for see also, that's also a way of kind of capturing those associative relationships as well. In addition to the RT for related term, we have just one example here on this page for that Mercury planet exploration. There's an RT for space flight to Mercury. So these are two both valid headings, but just mean slightly different things. And then the use, like that, this use one is very important because once again, it tells you if you do end up at a variant form, like at the very bottom here, like Mercury planet globes, it says to use instead Mercury planet maps. So it's kind of the opposite of the UF, right? So we want to use Mercury planet maps and not Mercury planet globes, right? So that's the basics of LCSH within classification web. Like I said, I'll show you kind of what the other tools look like in just a minute. But finally, just another important point about Library of Congress subject headings to keep in mind as you apply and use Library of Congress subject headings is that it does contain a lot of scientific and legal terminology, because keep in mind that Library of Congress subject headings were created for the user population of Library of Congress, which are members of Congress, scientists, medical professionals, legal scholars, and so forth. So there's a lot of scientific and legal terminology there. That's how they primarily decide on what to include. So we want to use myocardial infarction, hopefully I said that right, and not heart attack. Aliens and not unnaturalized foreign residents. So because then in the U.S. legal code, it's like aliens or illegal aliens. Another way to say like non-citizens and unauthorized immigration. I don't know if you guys saw this a few years ago, but Library of Congress, kind of under pressure from the library community and the American Library Association, agreed to change illegal aliens and replace it with two new headings, non-citizens and unauthorized immigration. But members of Congress tried to block it, and so they kind of just abandoned that effort for now. Those involved in trying to change that heading have just decided the political climate is such that it's best just to kind of leave it alone. But there was some outrage, not just from librarians, but from patrons, that illegal aliens was offensive. So that comes up, a bit when discussing Library of Congress subject headings, is that sometimes terminology is used that is not appreciated by all members of the population, but that's a whole nother can of worms that we're gonna not get into right now. But otherwise, obviously, Library of Congress is looking to create terminology that best suits its population, but also it uses literary warrant. Okay, that's also extremely important to keep in mind when trying to determine why a certain term is used. They use what's in the literature. So they include a heading or change a heading based upon what is actually used in the literature, right? So they don't just pull headings out, of thin air. They try to just use what they see that's being published, right? And the targeted user historically has been like American, Western European, Christian, white, heterosexual, cisgender, and male. And it's gotten better recently in trying to be more inclusive, but there still are kind of remnants of that throughout. So just an example, like the heading for librarians, let's say, I'm just going to pull that out. There's all sorts of these great narrower terms for specific, types of librarians, like different categories, right? So like African American librarians, women librarians, children's librarians, and so forth. But there's no heading for like male librarians, let's say, because it's assumed that you're talking about a male librarian if you use the term librarian, unless you want to. So kind of keep that in mind, that there's still kind of those remnants of this kind of focus. But once again, that's another area that I'd love to talk about further, but we don't have the time to do that now. But all right, how to access LCSH. So Library of Congress subject headings is only online now. It's no longer published in print format. So you have to choose one of these sources to find Library of Congress subject headings. There might be other ones out there, but these are the main four. And I've already talked about Classification Web. That's from the Library of Congress. They own that, where you can search and browse LC subject headings, but it is subscription-based, so you have to pay for it. So I do believe, if you're curious, they do offer like a 30-day free trial. So, give it a shot. But if you use OCLC Connection, you can also find LCSH there, but that's once again also subscription based. And the two free sources are the LC Authorities website. That's once again the Library of Congress's authority file, and then the LC Library of Congress linked data service. Okay, so I'll show you some examples of this from there. All of them except the connection one. So first of all, here's Classification Web. Where you have to log on. Like I said, it's subscription based. And here you can see all the various resources they provide in Classification Web, which goes beyond just LCSH. You can access the Library of Congress classification schedules, the genre form terms, demographic, all sorts of good stuff, right? So lots of good stuff there. But if for LCSH, we want to click on one of the third or fourth link down, and then you log in. And then for the search, you should see a screen like this where you can search by a subject heading if you know what it should be. If you don't, then maybe keyword might be best. The free-floating subdivision search, that's for subheadings, which we will talk about next time. So I'm setting that aside for now. You can also search by classification number if you have that, or a record number if for authority records. So, but I really want to focus on this top search here for subject heading. So let's just say that I'm cataloging a book on, or I'm trying to find a book on equestrians, okay? So equestrian. So if I type that into the subject heading search and just hit enter or search, then you should get an entry like this. So similar to what we saw with the Mercury one, but in Library of Congress subject headings, the equestrians is not the authorized heading. It says use horsemen and horsewomen. So again, even though you may think, wait a minute, that seems more like a centaur and not actually someone who like rides a horse or involves some way with a horse, that's weird. Sorry, that's not what Library of Congress subject headings uses. Equestrians is not what they use. These horsemen and horsewomen. So as you can see here, it's hyperlinked. So we want to click on that to get to that entry in LCSH for further information. So there. So that's the first thing. So if you see the non-bolded heading, that means you don't use it. You use something else instead. If you don't get anything, then probably going back and searching again would be appropriate. Maybe doing a keyword search. But if you get a bold heading that fits what you're looking for, bam, you got it. So I'm going to go to the horsemen and horsewomen entry. This is what it looks like. Similar to, like I said, what we saw with the Mercury example, but a few more things here to take a look at. So first of all, as we talked about, we want to use the entry in bold, right? The horsemen and horsewomen in this case, and so forth. Also, again, say it again, we don't want to use the UF terms, so equestrians, women equestrians, the former heading. Sometimes it gives the former heading of like horsemen, case, or horsewomen and so forth. So don't use those. You can see the broad term as well. But if our book is just about cowboys, then use cowboys, as we talked about, the specificity, the scope match. We want to focus on what the work is specifically about. So if the work is specifically about cowboys, use cowboys, not horsemen and horsewomen. Okay? And then once again, we can click on the hyperlink cowboys to go to that entry as well. But you can see here, there's many different types of horsemen and horsewomen. So including people who don't really ride horses, like horse owners, I guess, and so forth, but whatever. The double dash, as I mentioned before, indicates a heading-subheading relationship, which narrows the focus of the topic. So if you have a work on horsemen and horsewomen in the United States, then using this horsewomen dash United States will be appropriate, right? So again, we'll talk more about subheadings a little bit later. There's also this may subbed geog. This tells us whether or not a heading or a subheading can be subdivided geographically. So if we can put a geographic subheading there, like United States is an example of that. So we will get into that next time because that gets interesting at times if we want to include a geographic area as part of the heading. Also, if you use Library of Congress classification, this is really handy, especially in Class Web, because it associates quite a few of the LCSH with the LC classification number. Okay, so that can be helpful. You can just click on the hyperlink to get to the classification schedules. and then what I call the ghost rectangle, which shows us like Dewey and LC correlations. That can be also very handy if you have the subject heading, you found the right one, but you need to find the corresponding classification number. Bam, this is going to be really, really handy. So, okay, so that's class web in a nutshell. I know I kind of quick, but I want to make sure I cover everything here. Library of Congress Authorities is that free resource we can use to search for Library of Congress subject headings, but it's the authority records. Okay, so if you're not familiar with authority records, don't worry, you'll see in just a minute. But it's not going to look the same way as what we just saw in class web. But we click on the search authorities. This is Library of Congress's authority file. So you can search not only subjects but also names, titles, and then name, title, authority headings, as well as just keywords. So if I search for horsemen and horsewomen, I want to make sure that I highlight the subject authority heading search type, and then click on begin search, and then I get a list here. A lot kind of going on here, but just kind of focusing on like the horsemen and horsewomen here. This first entry, I can see that it's under the type of heading. It is Library of Congress subject headings. That's good. That's what I want, because sometimes there's other control vocabularies listed here, like the children's list. On the left-hand side, you'll see the red rectangle. We really want to focus on those ones that are like the authorized heading. So this tells us it's authorized, but you may end up with one with the variant form, like that you can see under that horsemen and horsewomen African American, with the red rectangle that says references. That means it's a variant form. So we can still get to the authorized form that way, but that's a good way, immediate kind of clue of what is authorized and what's not. Okay, so in this case, we just want to click on the authorized and references rectangle there on the left-hand side to get to the authority record. But you can see here that there's a lot of the same information that we already saw, right, in classification web. It's just presented in a slightly different way, right? So here, like all the various narrower terms, we want to click on the authority record, which for those guys who know MARC, this shouldn't be too scary, but if you don't, I'll show you how to look at it in not MARC. But you can see here in the 150 field, whatever the preferred or authorized form of the subject heading should be. Variant forms in the 450 fields, the ones you should not use, as well as some additional information there in the 670 fields that we don't see in class. So quite frankly, sometimes I find the authority record to be more helpful than classification web in some senses. So, and it just really makes you wonder in this particular case, that it keeps bringing up equestrians, and that's not what the authorized heading is, which interesting. Anyway, but you can also view the same information without the MARC. That's totally fine. So within that same view, like there's two tabs there. One is the MARC display. You can just click on label display, and then you can see that same information without the MARC coding. All right, if you feel more comfortable looking at the information without the MARC coding, that's totally fine. You can just look at the label display. And same thing with id.loc.gov, which is Library of Congress Linked Data Service. It's all, you can see here, there, and the screenshot that we can search for more than just Library of Congress subject heading. There's LC classification, the children's subject headings, all sorts of good stuff here. That's free. So this is another great free resource for you to search various vocabularies. Here I'll just search for LCSH. That's what we're focused on. So just using the same example of horsemen and horsewomen. So here you can see horsemen and horsewomen, the vocabulary list. It's a topic and so forth. And I just want to click on the horsemen and horsewomen in this case, and it's kind of a long page, so I had to kind of cut and paste things and to fit this on my screen. So just kind of imagine this as kind of scrolling through. Once again, a lot of the same information as we saw in the other two resources, with horsemen and horsewomen being that authorized form that we see at the top of the screen. Variants that are included there down the left-hand side, you see variants, broader terms, the narrower terms, and so forth. So once again, same information generally, but just presented in a slightly different way. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're trying to find subject headings, there's these different tools we can use, and feel free to just, use different ones depending on how comfortable you are with each of these. And Library of Congress subject headings can come in many forms. Okay, so you may be wondering, okay, well, is there like a certain pattern to these headings? And there's different ways that can be presented. So like it's just simple nouns, okay, like children, dogs, libraries, compound nouns, nouns with parenthetical qualifiers. We talked about that. But they can also get quite complicated, like nouns with adjectives, like gifted children, wild dogs, academic libraries, and sometimes inverted, like sculpture, comma, American. That's one valid heading. And also with phrases with prepositions, like teachers of gifted children, photography of dogs, and so forth. Compound phrases, like children and older people, bolts and nuts, which always drives me nuts when I see it, because I want it to be nuts and bolts, but I can't control that. So anyway. And then complex phrases, right? So you may just be like, how is this possible? This is a Library of Congress subject heading, but it can be. These phrases like names carved on trees, infants switched at birth, and monkeys as aids for people with disabilities. So keep that in mind. There's not just kind of one way that a Library of Congress subject heading is presented. So, and if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of kind of how Library of Congress subject headings are created and should be applied, the best source for that is Library of Congress's resource called the Subject Headings Manual, or the SHM for short. You can find it in Cataloger's Desktop if you have that, but it's also free online. I'll give you the link for that. But just in case you're wondering, this is an example. Okay, just as an example of what's in the Subject Headings Manual. If you're wondering, why are so many Library of Congress subject headings plural? Or you may not have wondered that before, but maybe you did. Is that according to this rule that the Library of Congress follows in creating main headings and subheadings, as it says, to use the plural form when establishing topical headings that designate entities capable of being enumerated, okay, that you count, all right? So like cats, artificial reefs, American newspapers, and so forth. But use the singular form when establishing topical headings, so topical meaning like, concepts and objects, that designate abstract concepts like sociology, love, and French art. Okay, so when in doubt, if you can count something, then you should probably search for it using the plural form as opposed to the singular form. So all sorts of awesome nuggets in there for the subject headings manual. This is just what it looks like in Cataloger's Desktop. There's all sorts of fascinating rules and instructions here. But you can also access this free online. I have the URL here on this slide, but you can also just do a Google search for the subject headings manual and find it as well. And it's the same information, but just kind of broken down into these PDFs. Okay, so I recommend going there if you do have any questions about why things are established the way they are. And just a reminder that we always want to use the authorized form of a heading. So for example, if the work is only about horsewomen, we still want to use horsemen and horsewomen, all right? You don't break it up. So like I mentioned at the very beginning, if you're using LCSH, you use LCSH the entirety, like of what the authorized heading should be. Same thing if you have a work that's about only one fire department, we still want to use the authorized heading fire departments, plural, okay? Right, so we just follow what it says to use. You want to use the narrower terms rather than broad terms if possible. And then usually the topical subject, so concepts and objects, are chosen as the main heading over like geographic, chronological, so time period, and form, okay? And we can usually use those as subheadings unless they're the focus. But the topical subjects are the more popular subject headings. And I already talked about the subheadings, so. And oftentimes we want to apply multiple subject headings to a work just because the work is about multiple things. But remember our 20% rule. So we only want to assign subject headings for topics that are covered at least 20% of the work, aiming to describe the work as a whole. So this work about, like dog breeds and dog care, presumably talks about like a variety of it's an encyclopedia, so lots of different dog breeds. you don't want to assign a subject heading for every single dog breed. It's about dog breeds and dog care, so that should be the subject headings that are applied to this work. But still, you want to assign as many subject headings as you feel are necessary to cover the subject of the work as the whole. And then the first subject heading that's listed in the record is usually the primary subject of the work. And the classification number, whether you use Library of Congress classification or Dewey, that number is assigned based upon the first subject field. Okay, so keep that in mind. So one of the few areas where we can kind of switch around the MARC fields if necessary. So, and it can be important to include multiple subject fields because users may want to access a single work in different ways. Right? So in this example that I started off with in this webinar, the cowboys, yeah, it's about cowboys. So obviously we want to include cowboys as the main heading here, but also someone, this presumably then discusses what life was like for these cowboys, and here like the frontier and pioneer life in West US. That can be something that if someone's interested in that topic, this book may be helpful. And just also about the West, the American West, the history of that. May not cover all of it, but it may be helpful for researching that particular topic. So keep that in mind. What are the kind of the different ways we can approach this work that may be helpful for a user to find it? Oh, and Eva, so good question. So I believe, and I need to double check this, I apologize, but for Library of Congress, okay, so for Library of Congress, they tell their catalogers to not assign more than 10. So I believe that they're kind of, the number of headings that they assign tend to be no more than like 5 or 7. That's usually, as far as they go, but it may depend on the work, but usually 5 or 7, depending on the work. But, you may have a work that, one subject heading is sufficient. So don't feel like you need to add a lot of subject headings to capture the subject if it's not truly about the work as a whole, if that makes sense. So does that help? I don't know if you may have a local policy on that, but okay, good. And then just quickly, I realize Christine's typing, so feel free to keep typing, but I'll kind of move on. I wanted to point out, so we're running out of time here, are the MARC fields for subjects. And I may kind of get into this a little bit more next time, but just to kind of point out that there's multiple type of subject fields for different types of subjects. So, oh, Christine, oh, that's a good question. For Dublin Core, I don't think that Dublin Core has any recommendations in that regard. In fact, it has very few recommendations total about subject fields. So with Dublin Core, it's, you can repeat the subject field as many times as you feel is necessary. So, but that's a good question. I don't know if the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative has any particular recommendations in that regard, but, oh, maybe you think PCC, okay, yeah. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know if PCC has any specific recommendation. I would assume, and don't quote me on this, but I would assume that PCC goes with what Library of Congress says to do, since they're so intertwined and connected. So that would be my guess. Yeah, and so you're welcome. And so I think if you look in the subject headings manual, I believe they would have the specifics on that as well. But anyway, so I just wanted to point out very quickly the MARC fields for subjects. You can see here like a personal name subject, the 600 field, popularly used for like biographies and autobiographies for someone's name. It's about that person. Corporate name subjects, conference name subjects, uniform title subjects, and so forth. The most popular field rather, probably the 650 for topical subjects, geographic subject 651. It's really just the 655 that is the only field where the information in that field should be what the work is versus what it's about. All the other ones, you should have headings in there for what the work is about, okay, what the work is about. And like I said, we're going to talk about form genre at a later point. But in the 650 field for the topical terms, you can see that typically the first indicator, if you're familiar with MARC, if you're not, then don't worry too much about this. The first indicator is generally blank. The second indicator tells us which list we're using. So if you're using Library of Congress subject headings, you use 0 in the second indicator spot. Okay, and you can see all these various other lists here, like LC children's literatures, the second indicator of 1, medical subject headings 2, and so forth. Okay, so and this is from the OCLC Bibliographic Formats and Standards website. And just to kind of point out the differences, right? So if you look at a record that contains both LCSH and another vocabulary like LC, the children's headings, even though the headings may be the same in some cases, in this case, that second indicator of 1 tells me this is, even though it's the same MARC field, the indicators tell me which list is being used. All right, so once again, even though on the patron view, you may not see this, you may just see like a duplication of headings. And in the back end, we can see this is actually 2 separate lists that are being used, right? And here's just some differences. I'm just going to move along here. I'm going to talk about form genre later. And just one final note, and this kind of eases me into what we're going to talk about for next time, is we want to assume that subject headings refer to nonfiction accounts of a topic unless it is implied otherwise from the heading itself. Otherwise, you need to further subdivide a main heading to convey it is a fiction account of a topic. So like detective and mystery stories in English fiction tells me this is fiction. But otherwise, if I just have horsemen and horsewomen or just Mercury Planet, that is a nonfiction account of the work, unless I add something like a subheading, for example, that says fiction or juvenile fiction or whatever, that shows that it is actually a fiction account of that topic. So that's quite important. So just as an example, here at the top, I have nonfiction works on high schools and dogs. But if I wanted to make it clear that Sweet Valley High and Old Yeller are both, very real in our hearts, obviously, but they're still fiction accounts of these topics, that they are fiction accounts, we want to add additional information to make that clear, right? And that's a good way to transition into this description of our next webinar, subheadings and Library of Congress subheadings. That's really important for kind of narrowing our focus. And that'll be a month from now, where we talk about subheadings and how to search the free-floating list and so forth. And then if you want a deeper dive into Library of Congress subject headings and those form genre headings, please join me in Fort Myers, Florida, in the lovely, lovely Swiftland office, Friday, February 22nd, so we can talk, going beyond the basics and with LCSH and the form genre headings and so forth. A lot of great stuff that we can use to, apply subject headings or form genre headings to our library of things, and all those very other cool things that are not as obvious about what we should do with the subject field. So, okay. So I realize I've gone over time. I'm really sorry, but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. So if you want to stay and ask any questions or talk, then I'm here. So, but I'll let Taylor say anything she needs to say at this point.
Thank you, Karen, for such a wonderful webinar this morning. As Dr. Snow mentioned, if you enjoyed this webinar, we ask that you join us on February 12th for her next webinar, Creating Subheadings in Library of Congress Subject Headings.
Kind of hard to say.
As always, we encourage you to keep an eye on the Swiftland CE calendar, the Swiftland Facebook page, or your message from the listserv. Thank you everyone for attending and have a great weekend.